some of the things happening, it's just like absolute, hollowness of our existence.
It is really interesting because it probably kind of come into a lot of what we'll probably discuss later on in the podcast. But what we see is that you can see it from many angles. You can see it from a systems place, you can see it from an educational place, from a health perspective. What you see is that there's a disablement of communities and people. And I think similarly as academics, where we're in a place of needing to be creative in our expression, what we have is sort of politics and a certain culture that pushes down on debate, and debate and dialogue are incredibly important in times of conflict.
The worst bit is like, the people who are actually kind of documented unreliable, not good people for humanity. They are in the forefront. They're in charge of the knowledge. It's like, Edward Said's kind of, the world we are living in. He tried to explain, explore, and expose the problem, but it just, this violence in my lifetime, it's just witnessing this kind of violence in front of your eyes. I mean, I think it take time for people to, recover from this.
I think that it's really interesting on sort of various fronts. One is that due to technology and access on social media, we're also understanding the level of suffering that conflict brings about. I think if we would have had the same when, say, for example, the illegal Iraq invasion, we would have also been able to witness, the sort of death and mortality, but it is unprecedented. And I think what you see is a complete sort of hypocrisy, I think, from the West, and how much they manipulate the agenda. That's where I think that this sort of what's happening in Palestine, even if you're not Palestinian, but I believe that it's something it's a conflict that's affected all of us, and I think it should affect all of us, because we see that we have no real frameworks, no legal frameworks that are actually working. We can see the debilitating state of the UN, and I think that's a space where everyone needs to come in and sort of either be aware of or do something about it.
Sorry, I started with something very depressing.
No, it's fine. I think the conversations need to be had, and I think these are difficult conversations that we shouldn't shy away from.
Seems like, we are allowing these things to happen in front of your eyes, and we just, we don't have power to do anything about this.
No, and I think that's a really important point, because there's a lot of powerlessness in the West. And I don't think you see the same in the global South. I think you see a lot of resistance still in the global South, because those community networks haven't been completely disabled. People still gather, neighbors still, conjure. That's kind of part still of culture, where it hasn't been completely sort of, people haven't been isolated because of neoliberalism and sort of our economic systems, so to speak.
So the plan is, I mean, there's no plan, Claudia. So what we'll do is like just have a conversation and see whatever comes up. So a bit of your story as well. I'm quite interested about our personal story, our journey in this planet. Also, I'm quite interested in that particular theme. Like we talk about development and progress. I mean, I did a podcast with an artist a couple of months ago. So he was born in Glasgow. Then I was trying to ask him, or find him, exactly where he was born in Glasgow. And he was saying that if you tell me where I was born exactly, I was actually, today it's a super store, Asda. My home is now Asda. Sometimes he goes back to that Asda and try to find out like under which shelf he was born. So, so that's like our development. That's our progress. It's like
Mm-hmm.
question of
Mm-hmm.
our memories, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
so I never thought that way. The philosophical understanding about our,
Place
our
and geography.
place.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think that's part of our human instinct, like to want to go back to those memories, try to, go back to the schools, where you 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 were there, uh, playing in the playground, those memories. But I mean, this artist, there's no memory there. It's just concrete, absolute concrete, and like dog food, you know, because that's the shelf, for
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's his shelf. Yeah, pet food.
it will be interesting. And also things like, the sustainable development, and then no one
Yeah,
should
yeah,
be
sure.
left behind, all those vacuous plan aim by the powerful. I mean, what's the plan? Will they like kill us this time, or like, leave us bit? So,
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy to do that.
so that's the plan. So we can start with, like, I mean, if you just give us some kind of understanding what you do, so it's just like a bit of your small biography about your academic side. So I'm not touching the other side. So just academic side. What what's the thing you're doing right now? Some exciting stuff, the project, the teaching. Tell us a bit more about those things.
Talking about where I am now as an academic, um, a lot of my work has centered initially around concepts of empowerment, education, looking at sort of what we understand about global development, which I think is quite problematic when we see sort of what's happening within the current climate. And obviously, I lecture in International Humanitarian Affairs at the University of York. So that involves modules like examining humanitarianism, communities in emergencies, protection and assistance, which looks at those legal frameworks which are meant to be protecting communities which are currently experiencing a crisis and disaster, and also now with the issues on climate crisis. So those are kind of the really broad topics that I work on research-wise. I've just come back from a trip in Colombia. So I am originally from Colombia, which was fantastic to be able to come back, not just sort of as a national, but also as an academic, and be able to sort of delve into sort of some of those political, social, and humanitarian issues which are happening. Something really interesting was I had the pleasure to visit what in English is known as the Levy Channel. In Spanish, it's called El Canal del Dique, and it's in northern Colombia.
Mm.
So, this is sort of quite a fascinating ongoing issue within this canal. So it's man-made. It was originally first engineered by the Spanish in 1582, so our the old colonial power. And what they did is they created sort of this channel to be able to sort of bring in sort of more export and move in waters from the Magdalena River. And so what's happened is, in 2010, because it was sort of badly engineered and hasn't been sort of really looked after, what we had was a burst of the channel, which this happened in 2010, and it displaced millions. I think it displaced 2 million within the region. It also took 2 years for the waters to be able to disperse. And what you have is the Canal del Dique is also quite famous. So they call it the aquatic cemetery. So within the conflict that's been happening in Colombia for so many decades, what you had is sort of dead bodies being thrown in this canal. So there's a really sort of dark aspect to that relation between the fishing community. One, because that's their source of food. Climate crisis is also hit now. So there's a depletion in what we have as sort of our natural species.
Mm.
of fish. There's also a huge multi-million-dollar development project that's being led by a European company, which is looking to rain havoc on sort of this area, and also the fishing men in particular, and then obviously the women within sort of those communities. So it's a very sort of interesting and contentious topic. And what you see sort of at the root of it is, again, that struggle between wanting to be sustainable or wanting to provide a form of development project which is for the people, but it's actually so completely removed from the needs of the people. And again, we're, seeing these local communities not understood as sort of the experts or ecological experts as well, who really understand the whole kind of fishing cycle and sort of regeneration and ecology within this area. So I think throughout my work, it's, even though I go to sort of different contexts, I can see the same recurring patterns.
Mm. I actually never knew that. No, so you were born in Colombia. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was born in Colombia in the 80s.
Okay. Tell us.
And yeah, I think that's quite an interesting time because it's when you had sort of famous Pablo Escobar, which was raining havoc around the country, particularly in Medellin. So I'm also from Medellin. And that on top of sort of deprivation, also family issues, because I think we very much mirror our society. And when we have sort of such violence within our society, it's also extremely common to be able to have those same patterns of violence within family settings. And so that was what really propelled my mum to leave Colombia in the 80s. I stayed, and my mum sort of, but she wasn't able to sort of bring me for a couple of years. And then her sort of life in the UK was probably just as hard, but it was a different hard. A lot of people think that because you migrate from your country, which, there is sort of crises or a disaster unfolding, that somehow it's a lot rosier in sort of your foreign or adopted country. And it's not always the case. I think there's cultural displacement that refugees face. I think there are massive issues on sort of security, lack of network, lack of community, which sort of refugee people go through.
Mm.
And that was definitely sort of an experience that I had, an experience that my family had. So when you see current policies and government policies in the UK, for example, being so hostile against refugees and migrants, I think it's a real shame that they're being sort of blamed for the ineptitude of our government and also of our economic systems.
Mm. Tell us a bit more about your earliest memories about Colombia, the, your
Of
school, your surrounding.
course. So my earliest memories, I think still to this day, if you go to Colombia, there's a lot more freedom. And it's not to say that the global south, the global south has just as many sort of issues and hierarchical issues as sort of the global north. And I know within sort of the much broader discussions on coloniality and
Mm,
localization with
mm, mm,
humanitarianism, we tend to sort of say that all the issues of the global south are because of the global north. And that's not kind of what I'm saying here. But within those cultural structures, especially in Latin America or in Colombia, where I grew up, the children have a lot more freedom. So I would play a lot in the streets. There are pictures of me, yeah, just playing, shirtless with shorts and trainers. There's that kind of freedom that I think a lot of children experience. There's also a lot more relations with your neighbors because they are your go-to. I mean, that is your almost kind of like that is your social network. I mean, that is your welfare system, so to
mm,
speak.
mm,
And
mm,
so there's a lot more trust within those relations. And that was something that I experienced. I do remember sort of you could go for hours and no one knows where you are, but somehow you're sort of relatively safe. You know, it's not to say that things don't happen, but that was sort of my experience. I grew up in a very poor area in Colombia, in a very dangerous area in Manrique, which at that time was notorious for being kind of a hotspot for the recruitment of sicarios, what we say in Colombia, sort of Pablo Escobar's hitmen, and they would sort of very much draw the youth to what is sort of the allure of money and being within mafia. So that was, you know, one of the motivations of my mum to leave and be able to sort of bring her family to Europe.
Wow. Any school memories?
My first school or schooling was in the UK, and I went to school, I think 6 months after arriving. I went to Primary Hill School. And it was very difficult for me to get used to the UK. So I was missing the sun. I remember I arrived in December, and I remember telling my mum, like, you know, where's the sun in this country? There's no sun here. So I was quite disappointed. But, you know, I think like with children, you sort of grow, you adapt. And I think that's important.
That's like, I mean, that's one of the like scariest thing about our existence as a like Homo sapiens. We are quite like, our adaptability is just amazing, isn't it? We can actually, you know, go through war for 30 years. But like, no, in my understanding about Colombia, because the way it was portrayed in the media, the first thing come to mind, oh, Colombia is a very dangerous country. But what you were saying, within all those things, you've got some amazing memories about the sun, about the playing outside, about the freedom.
Yes, yes. I think Colombia in particular is a very complicated country. I think its politics is very complicated. It's also quite divided. I also think that I really think it's a mixed bags. You know, I was there, we had an incredible time. I think Colombian people are one of the warmest, you know, kindest, liveliest, creative, intellectual people around. So it was fantastic to be kind of feel amongst my own. That was a really nice feeling that I got. But, you know, you said something really interesting where you talk about adaptability, and there's a lot of, you know, one of the most kind of common concepts that we use to discuss adaptability, and when we talk on sort of humanitarian terms, we talk about resilience. And I think resilience is quite problematic because it almost sounds like you're a rubber band, that you're able to sort of be stretched and then you come back, but there's no tear in your form. And I think when we look at sort of families and communities and societies that have been through crisis, I don't believe that resilience actually captures that process. I believe that there is a sensitivity that us as people go through. I think there's a kind of bruising, and I'm not saying vulnerability, but you know, we go through sensitivities, and when we come back and gather ourselves, there are still sort of fragments of us which are sort of broken, that need to be sort of in place. And I think that's where reconciliation, healing, being able to have sort of greater conscientization on who we are, what we are, our states, is so important, to be able to fill those kind of gaps that have been fragmented because of sort of those experiences or ruptures, so to speak.
So I was talking to a climatologist who was in Dubai, COP28. He's also from Bangladesh. So like, Bangladesh is one of those countries, you know, the worst affected by flood and all those, you know, climate related problems. I actually never knew that, because I was born in Bangladesh, so, and then I left young as well, but not as young as you. I was like more adult. It's like small stories. Terrified about these stories. The story is like, every single day in Bangladesh, around 2,000 people. These are climate refugees. internally displaced, come from their home to the capital city, Dhaka. And no one knows what actually really happens after that to these 2,000 people. Every day they're coming. I mean, you can see, so you just like, it's like rooting out like plants from one place and then throw them somewhere. And then ask them, you have to find your sunshine, you have to find your, I don't know, food, nutrition, anything. I mean, it's just unbelievable stories. That's like every day there are 2,000 stories being unfolded. No one knows about those stories.
No, the sort of the scale, and I talk about it in some of my writings, is that there's a huge trade-off that's happening, and the ones that are on the losing end are affected communities, which are bearing the brunt of this supposed sustainable and development agenda. And I think, as you mentioned, Bangladesh is one case, for example. We see it within the continent of Africa. We see it within sort of the Congolese people. You have roughly, 1 million displaced Congolese, and that's been driven only by the tech industry, for example, which is dependent upon those cobalt mines. And this is, I think it's projected at 484.8 billion on a smartphone industry, which will be growing at 858 billion in what is sort of electric car sectors by 2027. So it's an industry which is massive, and we understand that there are positives, and those that are the issue is this, that those that are reaping those benefits aren't the communities which are providing the resources. There isn't equity within these markets, but what you have is the profiteering of the misery of others. And I think that's where there's sort of a much darker aspect to modernity, as we call it. And it's not about shifting the blame on the users, because I think that's where capitalism and neoliberalism and our current governments have been so genius at being able to make people feel guilty if you haven't separated your cardboards, or if you've brought a plastic bag and so forth, whilst they are displacing absolute millions, and then kind of shift that sort of individual blame. So I think it's a systems issue. I think that's the core.
No, like whenever I teach about the climate justice, because I teach a course about United Nations politics, and I see my students, the young generation, their frustration, and they're saying, what's the use of this? The people who are in charge, running our society, countries, I mean, they don't care. So they're spending billions of dollars every year for fossil fuel subsidies, when they are supposed to, stop these things. And I mean, you can see the frustration, and they are asked that you have to be, green. You have to. So even like our campus is absolutely green, like they try to restrict everything, anything. But it seems like, no, even if you look at the latest COP28, I mean, it's the fanfare. Just unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, especially about this COP, with the amount of lobbyists that were having access to policymakers. But then that same access isn't being given to communities which are sustainable, to rural farming communities, with those which are actually keeping alive our, quite delicate ecosystems. Just drawing from sort of that example in Colombia, this fishing community, which is sort of trying to salvage our native fishes within this sector, where was their invite, for example? That's what I'm trying to say, that there's a complete disparity when it comes to access of resources, where it comes to sort of allowing those who truly understand sustainability, ecology, regenerative practices, they're nowhere, because they're nowhere within the mainstream discussion. I mean, they're very busy doing their work, and it's us who need to be sort of learning from them. And I think that's where I have such a problem, or I push back, where we call those communities vulnerable, because they are, you know, they have an expertise, and yes, their situation is vulnerable, but it's not because they themselves inherently are. It's because we've created these systems which are sort of really sort of destabilizing their sort of current livelihood.
Because I mean, then I mean, there are lots of literature in terms of the post-colonial theories. I mean, you know, how the people who are in power, they decide that those people actually, you know, cannot speak, so we have to speak for them. So, so there's like famous, you know, literature written by Gayatri Spivak about the subaltern cannot talk. So if you're women in India in the colonial setting, so you're the bottom of the pile. That means no, you're not even allowed to even like say anything. So you have to say something, and then someone will pick this up, and then someone will interpret, and someone will then process those things. It's absolute no agency for these people. I mean, you can see like with the COP20, like a couple of things. I'm just really horrified about, you know, some of the things they do. So they invite sponsors, like, you know, to sponsor their products, and in the COP28. So like last COP Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, the one of the key sponsors was actually Coca-Cola.
Oh yeah.
And like, so the rule is there are like 3 tiers of sponsors. So if you pay like 25 million, then you will have the access to the main venue and like talk to the people who are actually making those like policy. So who will have $25 million, and who will these people will be the full access to those people? So it's already ring fenced that the mass is totally excluded. So it's like, you know, my idea whenever I talk about, you know, Palestine, Israel, it's like, you know, you want to make peace, but you want to make peace excluding Palestinians. So like, what peace we are talking about, you know? So the people who needs to have the agency, who are the actually kind of, you know, part of this project, and he said, no, you don't need to be there. You know, I'll speak for you. I'll take care of you.
Now, I think you've probably had a couple of years, particularly with I think it was the Me Too movement. You had sort of those very famous slogans saying, "We're the voice for the voiceless." And, you know, that became sort of very popular thing to say, to have sort of privileged women being able to speak about issues that isn't really their place. And I think to think that these communities are voiceless is a massive misinterpretation on sort of what's happening, all the realities on the ground, you know. But you talk about sponsorship, which I think is so interesting. I worked in sales and sponsorship a long time ago, so I understand the beast well. But you're completely right, because one, if we look at it from a humanitarian perspective, you know, you can't remove the context that we're in. You can't remove the economic landscape that we're currently operating from humanitarian disasters, conflict, climate crisis, and disasters. You know, it's absolutely impossible. We can't remove sort of what's happening in levels of deprivation, for example, away from our economic and political landscapes. And what we see is there is a continuous profiteering from sort of these massive modern challenges, you know. So if we're creating a gathering, which is so important to be able to have dialogue and to be able to, you know, come up with ideas, what we do again is anything that's built upon this model, but it follows it, you know. And I think that's sort of logical. And what we have is sponsorship. What you have is sort of companies and you know, industries which are actually causing so much pollution, which are actually causing issues on food scarcity, for example. They're the ones which are sort of out there having sort of those access. And, you know, if we go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, we have goal 2, which is, you know, to abolish hunger, you know, zero hunger, which is noble and it's moral within the cause, but it does not tackle the root issues. And that is where I have a massive issue with the Sustainable Development Goals, because yes, there should be zero hunger. Absolutely, that's noble and it's moral. But we do not talk about greed. What is it that's causing the hunger? You know, why are we not then saying, let's tackle the level of greed that we have in modern society? Let's talk about food sovereignty, for example. Like, you know, those are sort of the root issues that should be mentioned, but they're not. And again, you have sort of the Sustainable Development Goals, as though the Millennial Development Goals, which failed. So it comes, you know, it's inherited by a failing project of mainstream sustainability, which is Western-led. And I think in this sense, that's the truth. And I don't believe that there's any legitimacy for a sustainable agenda that should come from the West. I believe that it should be inherently from the global South, and particularly from those communities which understand sustainability and ecology. Otherwise, I believe that what we're doing is we're just creating more markets, more capital, more conferences where we have the same people talking about the same issues, which really at the end of the day, they're there to make money or promote their own sort of careers.
Mm, mm. Another thing I want to touch is like, you know, this like progress, and then how the progress was sold to us, you know, taking away our things, our lives, our assets, our homes. So like during this like Israel-Palestine crisis at the moment, one of the things coming out is like, you know, this like transport system. So the Suez Canal in Egypt played a huge role in like, you know, this modernization and development and all those things. But if you look at the history of Suez Canal, it was built by France and UK. So you went to another country and you dug a canal which actually connected to sea. I mean, it's like, you know, someone from somewhere came to New York and said, decided that, you know what, we'll dig a big river in the middle of New York. How do you feel about that? And we'll dig it for 10 years, and then there might be like over 100,000 people will get killed, or like, you know, because of, you know, things we'll impose on them, will not pay them at all. And then in terms of environmental disaster, will not take care of it at all. So so that's the story of like, you know, Suez Canal. I mean, Suez Canal was also kind of, you know, if you look at the what you're talking about, the profiteering and then the war industry, it played a huge role. Like one of the stories, like before Second World War, Italy suddenly decided that they need to have some kind of colonies as well, because everyone has got a colony in Europe. So
why can't they? Yeah.
yes, why can they? So and then they went after like Abyssinia, like today's Ethiopia, you know, like it's just unbelievable story. And there was a like League of Nations created by the time already, and obviously, you know, the countries said, no, we cannot do it, man. This is now we've got League of Nations, no, so this is serious violation of international law. And they put like sanctions in the League of Nations, which actually affected Ethiopians more than actually Italy.
Yeah.
The easiest thing they could have done is they could have just stopped Suez Canal crossing so that the Italy's warships could not go through.
But they can't hurt the capital. I think that's the issue. I think, you know, in sort of your discussion, what we see is that the priority is the capital. And I think that's where we have a very ill or sick economic and social system, because human well-being and those concepts of empowerment and human flourishing, they come way beyond. And, you know, really, there's sort of those which are, it's a privilege,
Mm.
you know, and it's something that's not for everybody to be able to benefit from human flourishing. And you've got sort of two really interesting academics. For example, you've got Martha Nussbaum, which talks about those inherent human capabilities that need to be expanded, and you have Amrita Sen, who's a really famous economist, and he talks about that development should be freedom. So development is freedom. So if we're looking at global development, that should only allow people to be able to be more free. But within our global development systems, what we have at the moment is an idea of modernity, an idea of development, which is actually continuously preventing and constricting health and well-being. And we're making these communities ever more dependent on humanitarian aid because of the increase of conflict and disasters, but then taking away sort of that ability to be self-governed, I think is sort of important. And I think within all of this discussion, at the heart of particularly my research, when I looked at what is empowerment, social links and bonds of love and bonds of care are incredibly important. So I think that's also an area which needs to be sort of discussed more and looked at more when we look at equality, when we look at empowerment, when we look at development.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to go back to your academic side as well. What was your topic for your PhD? I mean, is it like similar kind of area?
It is, yeah. So for my PhD, I looked at education and whether our mainstream education system empowers women from the global south. And so those were the kind of very two broad concepts, which is empowerment and education. And in that, what we had was sort of that link of well-being. So empowerment isn't necessarily associated with economic progress, although economic progress is obviously important because it allows us to facilitate certain capabilities and resources. That's understandable. But then what we have is an imbalance within our societies where we very much trampled on sort of health and concepts of joy and peace, and you talk about peace within sort of those discussions that you mentioned. And I really believe that we're very far away from understanding what peace actually means. What we have currently is negotiations of, where when we won't sort of interact in armed conflict, but there is no resolution, there is no reconciliation, there is none of sort of those processes of healing within our peace negotiators. And I think also interestingly, I don't know, I wonder if you know, but I don't actually know of any well-known female peace negotiators. I believe that they're mainly sort of men, and I think that's not that that's an issue, it's just I find it odd because it talks about our understanding of peace right now, which is sort of very much within sort of this agenda of war. And I really believe, particularly where sort of I delve into different philosophies of Hindu, Buddhism, also approaches on concepts which are, non-mainstream. There needs to be more of femininity, or more of the feminine principle within how we're looking at sustainability, which it's not based on gender, but it's kind of on sort of those energies that we manage, and ideas of regeneration and reciprocity, which is something that definitely we don't look at within sort of our economies. It's how much can I take from you, rather than what can I give to you. And that falls into also our ideas of human rights. They're very much individualist. We don't have collective rights or responsibilities. And going back to, I don't know about your upbringing, but definitely my upbringing as a child refugee, as a young girl that grew up within sort of quite difficult situations, I learned very early on that I had certain duties and responsibilities with my family, and I would look after my cousins, or I would help here, or I would help there. And I see those models within my culture as well, that there isn't this idea to a certain degree, we need individual rights, absolutely, but there's a complete sort of neglect of that collective duty, and that's problematic.
Mm, mm. Because, I mean, that's like 80s UK, especially like when like Thatcher and like Ronald Reagan came to power with their idea about society. I mean, I think Thatcher mentioned something about, there's nothing called society. It's all about your responsibility, So if you fail, it's you who fail, Don't blame anyone.
And that's very much that neoliberal thinking,
Mm,
which really, how much, if, and it's so true what you say, because, you either you have to sacrifice your health, you have to sacrifice your peace and your joy on the altar of sort of efficiency, because otherwise, you're not good enough for the system, because our values are now on sort of, our worth is monetary so much of it is, and I think that's just so inverted. So it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because we see that again. We see that kind of dehumanizing language. We see it in the conflict that's happening right now in Palestine. There's a use of dehumanizing language
mm,
towards the Palestinians. There's a use of dehumanizing language within sort of the migrants which are crossing the border. We saw that within the Holocaust as well. And so this idea that there are subhumans, this idea that if you're failing, it's because you're not good enough, if,
mm,
that this you versus us, and that's kind of idea of individualism
mm,
to this extreme is, I think, largely responsible to how we're also treating our planet, and
mm,
the fact that we don't understand that we're intrinsically connected to one another and also to nature. And
mm,
so going back to those principles on oneness, going back to those concepts of care that aren't mainstream. And I'm not talking about a missionary driven approach, which is
mhm.
that idea of charity or philanthropy, because I don't believe there's any dignity in that.
If you go to like any Wikipedia page of any billionaires, there is a like section will be like his or her philanthropy.
I know. And what's sad is that they actually they don't give without taking, it's and that's kind of what charity is, and I
Mm,
believe it has that sort of missionary driven model.
mm, mm,
We're talking about, saving somebody, saving him from his, being barbaric, and this idea of the white man savior complex, which is still very much prominent nowadays. So I push a lot mutual aid when we talk about humanitarianism, and I look a lot at community approaches and how they themselves provide assistance when they're facing a crisis. And a very interesting concept that I grew up with in my household, which I didn't really, know the roots of, because you don't, is hoy por ti y mañana por mí, which is today for you, tomorrow for me. It's actually called Aini. It's an indigenous
mm,
concept of compassion or humanitarianism or humanity. And it places the onus on me helping you first. But
mm,
it also, very interestingly, it also is a form of saying, I need help and thank you at the same time, and acknowledges that tables turn, that one day I'm going
mm,
to be needing your help as much as you're needing my help today. And so that's the idea of reciprocity
mm,
that we fail to have within a charity lens, where it's continuously the one giving help to you, or that sort of philanthropy idea, right, which is sort of benevolent in the way that I'm saving you. So what I found fascinating is, and it's a very common saying within South American households, is that we're constantly reminded that one day I'm also going to be in need of help. And so the importance of placing family, friends, and kind of community at the center of sort of these networks.
mm,
And I think there's also dignity in
mm.
giving. When you go, for example, or where I've just kind of come back from in Colombia, every household that you go to, people want to offer you something. There's
Yeah.
a sort sort of idea of giving, and also within communities that you visit, which are, you know, in sort of some of the most difficult situations, or, you know, in refugee camps, that there's still that idea of giving your guests something, be a glass of water, some tea, which shows that there's dignity within these communities despite being sort of shouldering so much deprivation that's kind of placed upon them.
Like, I mean, in terms of your like job area, so you're an academic. I mean, how much of you is also a practitioner as well? You know, you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really depends on your sector. Because I'm an academic within humanitarianism, I genuinely believe that I need to be in the field just as much. One, because I lose any credibility if I'm really not working with communities. And I think those solutions to modern challenges will come with co-learning and co-working with sort of affected communities first and foremost. Two, I think it's an incredible part of sort of my work to be able to also feel part of, you know, these affected communities, and work collaboratively with them, and to be able to offer our students not just sort of the theory behind humanitarianism, not only sort of those critical debates or those intellectual discussions, but also really discuss kind of the realities on the ground. So in order for us to be able to reimagine alternative futures, reimagine how a humanitarian system ought to operate in, I think we need to be in the thick of it to sort of understand all those nuances. You know, it's fine and you know, all well to be able to talk about localization, decoloniality within humanitarianism, but I think it takes on a completely different approach when you're talking with those affected, when you're unlearning from them just as much as sort of discussing with them. So that's something that I try and maneuver. So at least a good proportion of my time is also doing research.
Does it mean, like, you know, because you are always in touch with those things, does it mean like it can also make you very radical as well? Because, you know, you see
I agree.
so much, you know, anger there, you know.
I wouldn't say anger. I wouldn't say anger, but I believe that there is definitely sort of I come from, as in, I wasn't born from a place of privilege. So I come from that refugee background. I understand that my family suffered a lot, also in Colombia. But I think what it makes me is there's a sense of responsibility that my work should be shrouded in humility. And I believe that it should have some impact, at least on myself, in the way that I conduct, you know, myself and my writing, that it should be for at least you know, have a positive impact on sort of those around me. So there is a greater sense of responsibility, and to be able to also have my research or frame my research in a kind of emancipatory stance, and not sort of discuss these communities as vulnerable, not continue to oppress them through my research, but on the contrary, be able to bring them in as kind of co-researchers, or, you know, as key stakeholders. I think that's incredibly important in sort of the work that I do and how I teach as well.
It shows your outreach, you know, like how you kind of connect with other people, you know. So you actually introduced me with Niels. I mean, that's an amazing person. Um, um, I mean, that's one of the interviews I've done. You know, it's difficult for me because he was giving me the first-hand experiences on the ground. I just feel like so helpless, you know, about listening to those things, and then absolute no idea what to do with these things. And people like Niels on the ground, you know, given all the dangers involved, but they're going there again and again. I mean,
He's going there, but you've got people which are remaining there. And I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that's, you know, that's a whole other ball game. You know, these people, these communities are survivors in so much that they do, and the way that they are able to adapt. And going back to those discussions that we're having about sort of adaptability, I mean, that's where the real strength lies, is in the communities which there is no coming or leaving. You know, there's staying and trying to make sense of it. And within that chaos, within that violence, there are pockets of care and love. And we've seen this through, for example, in Palestine, we see, for example, Palestinian men, doctors, health workers, the way that they're caring for one another. So you've seen these examples of incredible humanity in times of absolute misery.
I was really upset about one of the pictures I saw. This like Palestinian girl, I mean, who just lost her two legs. And there's a picture of her, she was not sad. You can see like, the life is there. The spark is there. The light is there. She was killed yesterday. So she survived the first one. And then she lost her legs. And then she's still, alive. And then she's gone. I mean, what's this about? I mean,
I think that there is an absolute routinized suffering that's happening within these communities. I also believe that it's incredibly difficult to be spectators of sort of the atrocities which are happening. If you read, for example, the work of Frantz Fanon, he's really interesting because he says that, for example, the violence that we're seeing in society is a reflection of a deeper conflict and violence that we have internally. And I think that's where we were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals as sort of external frameworks. We're looking at sort of international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law as external, but we're seeing that very much that they aren't able to hold peace. They aren't able to really sort of fundamentally bring about human development. And I think that's where there's an absolute appetite for inner development, internal transformation, and it starts sort of within. And I really, I'm a huge advocate where people feel completely helpless in the face of so much that's happening, but in being able to ensure that we're resisting a system which is telling us that we shouldn't care about the pain of others, or that we shouldn't care, or that we should feel disconnected to our planet. I think in the moment that we begin to resist that ideology, in the moment that we push together sort of more collectiveness, and I think it's absolutely, you have to be, if you're not human, if you're able to sort of see that and not feel anything, then there's something fundamentally wrong with you, in that you've been able to sort of become desensitized to what's happening. And I hope that we're coming to a point where this status quo, or that we're pushing back against this status quo, and we're actually looking at different approaches, because it's not working. And like I said right from the beginning, I don't believe that it is the West that is able to deliver these solutions to modern issues. I really believe that our solutions are coming from more of a collective thinking, from sort of the voices of those marginalized individuals which are currently living or having different approaches. I talked about Aini, which is a very simple phrase, but it completely changes the way that we understand humanitarianism. It completely changes the way that we begin to approach one another. So I think those changes start within ourselves. It's having conversations. It's being able to bring about this sort of collective movements to resist against what these current agendas are sort of pushing against us.
This can bring the discussion about your article. I kind of mean, I teach politics, and when I see names like Machiavelli, and you use Machiavelli in an article which has got something else there, isn't it? Much more deeper understanding about us, about our existence. Tell us a bit of background. Like, I mean, how did you come up with this, the whole idea about this article?
I mean, one, when we talk about it, it's a human trait. It's to be able to manipulate and profiteer of somebody else's misery. And behind all of our systems and behind all of these international agendas, which are currently sort of the mainstream, there are humans behind them. And there is a profiteering, because industries are, they're getting richer. You see, for example, somebody benefits from war. Our Security Council members, who are the ones that are meant to maintain peace, are the ones which are advocating also for the continuous massacres, not just of the Palestinians, but we know the Congolese, we know Sudan at the moment. These are, horrendous humanitarian issues which are happening. And so there is a much darker aspect to sustainability and global development. It's the same thing with colonialism. It's almost kind of a bit of a metamorphosis, like it's able to sort of reinvent itself in a really intelligent way. What happened with the Congo and King Leopold the Third, which was the same. It was a massive humanitarian project that he was doing, and to everybody else he was saving the Congolese. It's the same with sort of Latin American and the Spanish colonialists. Again, they were saving us from sort of our paganism and how barbaric we were. So again, what I believe is that it's painted as though it's good for humanity, but when you dig deeper into those trade-offs, you're seeing that it's being progress and development is being shouldered by a particular social group of individuals. And I think that is sort of that darker aspect to modernity.
Because then the politics always props up in my brain. Kissinger died a couple of years ago. He's the first state secretary, but also he was also in charge of security as well. He's the man also actually working for Lyndon Johnson before Nixon. And after 67, 68, Lyndon Johnson more or less decided that Vietnam War is a lost cause. So need to quickly kind of recover from this and get this thing done. But at the same time, Kissinger was also talking to Nixon as well. He was told that no, stall this peace process now. Okay, when I will be the president, we'll make peace then. So that took another 4 years. So Nixon became actually president and Kissinger got in. But by that 4 years, another 25,000 just American soldiers got killed on the ground. And we don't know the numbers of the people, Cambodia and Vietnam, Laos, absolutely no idea. It's just like one or two people, their aim, it's like profiting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. You're profiting. It's profiteering of misery and suffering. And also what you see is that, for example, within our Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this idea that we all have the right to life and dignity, it's it's not for everyone. I mean, that's the truth, that not everyone has the right. And I think we need to kind of come back to the basics, and fundamentally our society and our societal structures do not give that right to everyone, and that's a complete lie. And I think that we need to dispel that, because our systems are not equitable. We do not grieve the same way for all lives. Kissinger died and everybody knew about it. How many other children, innocent men, women from different parts of the world who are Black, brown, and so forth are not mourned in the same way? So life doesn't have the same value because we haven't given it that value. And that's why I'm saying that we really need to sort of come back to different approaches that rather than separate us, are sort of bringing us back together. And I think education is an incredible tool, and it's one that really needs to be sort of redesigned. And yeah, I think it's incredible that it's sort of in this day and age, we still have a very archaic system of learning, and what we learn, and the narratives, who dominates the narratives, what is taught, who's defining this idea that there is only one knowledge, one science, really legitimizes Western dominance on epistemology. There are knowledges and there are sciences that, we still don't understand. But to be able to say, this is science, no, there are sciences. And I think I think in so many ways, I think that's kind of pushing back on those kind of colonial projects.
That's quite interesting how, they create the knowledge for us that, this was a fine man. I mean, so Kissinger was given Nobel Peace Prize as well.
Oh yeah, of course.
It's one of those interesting, history most people don't know. So it was a joint peace prize.
Yeah.
So the Vietnam side, the person who got the Nobel Peace Prize with Kissinger, he never accepted it. So like, what's this about? But I mean, Kissinger was there in like Nobel Prize ceremony.
Yeah, of course. But we were talking. Yeah, that's also very, very similar to what happened with the Chipko movement by the rural women in India, where they were also acknowledged, but at the same time it was also a shared price, and they were acknowledged with sort of another scientist who had a completely contradictory idea of nature, where for them it was about sort of nature as separate, and the whole idea of Chipko is that you hug a tree, right? It's kind of where that ecological movement comes from. So it makes no sense. It's a conflicting agenda. It's what we were saying about, we have our Security Council members, which are meant to sort of be able to govern peace, but then they're, these are sort of countries which are some of the biggest exporters on weapons, for example. And so how does that make sense? There's no permanent seat for Latin America. There's no permanent seat for the continent of Africa. How does that make sense with regards to actual representation? Well, it doesn't. And so those are the structures that we're pushing back on, rather than it being a discussion about, the color of our skin or, where we're at. But we need to acknowledge that there are still sort of prominent, powerful agendas which are dominating sort of our kind of whole international movement and view on things. And I think that's where we need to get the discussion right.
I was talking to this like Black professor. I mean, he was sacked a couple of months ago. His name is Hakim Adi. So he's the first Black British-born history professor. And we're talking about, like the problem with like UK's, like race relations. And I was like, very casually made a comment that, this is harming Black community, the other community, the other people in the society. And then he interrupted me. He says, no, it's not only actually affecting or harming small group of people. Eventually, it will harm everyone. So that's the understanding about, the thing they are doing. It's not only harmed, like some people in Bangladesh or Colombia or some other countries. Eventually, this will harm everyone.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And to kind of begin to conclude the discussion, I really hope that if nothing else has sort of worked with regards to us being able to sort of see the humanity within ourselves, that we're going to be able to sort of connect closer through understanding that we are part of nature, and that we need ecology, we need nature to really sort of thrive. And if we continue to destroy our planet, we'll continue to destroy one another. So I hope that perhaps what's needed is more of awareness with regards to planetary health, and that becomes sort of at the forefront of some of our government policies. So I'm hoping that real meaningful sustainability, real and meaningful development, or development as freedom, is what emerges from the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Claudia, because I know our time is a bit limited today, but I would love to talk to you more about these things, because I'm so much I'm got so much interest in this kind of field, because in my field I see so much hypocrisy, so much recklessness, so much bad faith, and then you cannot talk about those things. So I think these kind of talks are for my own well-being as well.
Oh, absolutely. More than happy to, and to also kind of like have working groups with academics that are also pushing for a
Yeah.
different narrative, that are working differently, that are writing and speaking differently. And I think when you have that kind of association, like what we were talking about, when you come together in that collective, it's also similar to the work that Vijay Prashad, for example,
Yeah.
puts forward. And I think when you have that kind of collective spirit, I think it's important to be able to push out work that pushes back on that status
Mm.
quo and those narratives. So more than happy to create alliances
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also work with our students in being able to sort
Mm.
of really critically examine those systems.
Mm. Thank you so much for your time and everything you do, and I'm quite happy to get involved. Anything you want me to do.
2024, let's join forces. Let's look at sort of our teaching agendas. Let's look at
Yeah.
sort of research, writing together,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
more speaking, and we can bring in sort of our institutions
Mm.
to also kind of be at the forefront of these discussions. So thank you. I also really appreciate it. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thank you.